The bullet cracked past her ear, close enough to feel the heat, as Corporal Yemisi Adeyemi dragged Private First Class Brennan toward the outcropping of rocks that offered the only cover in this godforsaken riverbed. His blood was everywhere, soaking through her gloves, pumping from the wound in his neck where the round had torn through. She pressed harder, her fingers finding the artery, squeezing with everything she had while the world exploded around them. Staff Sergeant Colley's voice cut through her earpiece. All units fall back to extraction point. That is an order. Fall back now. She keyed her radio with her free hand while Brennan gurgled beneath her. Negative, I have a critical casualty. Need suppressive fire for evac. Brennan is hit bad. I need 60 seconds. The response was not gunfire covering her position. It was silence. Then movement. She looked up from Brennan's ashen face and saw them. Her own squad, running. Not toward her, but away, scrambling up the rocky slope toward the extraction point, while Taliban fighters poured rifle fire into the kill zone from 3 directions. Before we continue this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who served in places like the Karangal Valley, where moments like this decided everything. Colley, she screamed into the radio. Colley, I am pinned down. Do you copy? I am pinned down with a casualty. Nothing. Just the crack of incoming rounds and the wet sound of Brennan trying to breathe through the blood filling his throat. She looked into his eyes and saw the moment the light left them. Felt his pulse stop beneath her fingers. 22 years old. From some small town in Nebraska he never stopped talking about. Gone. She had no time to grieve. A round sparked off the rock inches from her head, and she flattened herself against Brennan's body, using the slight depression in the riverbed as cover. Her mind processed what her heart refused to accept. They left her. Her own squad left her in the kill zone. 400 meters above the valley floor, on a ridge the maps did not name, a man with pale blue eyes lowered his binoculars. Declan Vance had spent 3 years telling himself that none of this was his concern anymore. Not his war, not his fight, not his problem. He was just a contractor now, running security for supply convoys, collecting a paycheck, and trying to forget everything he used to be. But he had watched it happen. Watched the squad pull back while that woman stayed with her wounded. Watched the staff sergeant wave his men toward extraction without even looking back. Watched her scream into a radio that nobody answered. He knew what was happening down there. He had seen it before in places that did not exist on official maps. Someone wanted that woman dead, and they had found the perfect way to make it happen. Let the Taliban do the work. Call it combat losses. Move on with clean hands. Vance checked his rifle. Suppressed 417 Hong Kong dollars with a Schmidt and Bender scope. 12 rounds in the magazine. Sidearm with 2 extra mags. Enough to make a difference if he moved fast and shot clean. Not your problem, he told himself. You are not a SEAL anymore. You are nothing anymore. Just a ghost collecting hazard pay in a country that chews up ghosts and spits out bones. Down in the kill zone, Yemisi heard them coming. Voices shouting in Pashto, coordinating movement. She counted at least 6 distinct positions based on the muzzle flashes. Her M4 had maybe 2 magazines left. Her sidearm had 1. She had a knife, a med kit full of supplies that would not save her from bullets, and approximately 10 minutes before they closed the noose. She thought about her brother Chitty, dead at 17 on an Oakland Street corner because he was in the wrong place when the wrong people decided to make a point. She had joined the Marines because she wanted to save lives instead of watching them bleed out on concrete. Now here she was, covered in Brennan's blood, about to die in a valley half a world away from home because her own squad leader decided she was expendable. No, she whispered to herself. Not like this. I do not die like this. She pulled Brennan's dog tags from around his neck and shoved them in her pocket. Then she checked her rifle, controlled her breathing, and began scanning for the position that would give her the best chance of surviving the next 60 seconds. On the ridge, Declan Vance made a decision he could not explain to himself. He shrugged off his pack, keeping only his weapons and water. He marked the positions of the Taliban fighters in his mind. 6 confirmed, probably more. The woman had taken cover near an old shepherd's hut about 300 meters from his current position. Between him and her stood a goat trail, 2 enemy observation posts, and every reason in the world to walk away. He started down the ridge anyway. Below him, Yemisi Adeyemi saw movement on the rocks to her east. 2 fighters working their way toward her position. She steadied her rifle, controlled her breath, and waited for them to make a mistake. She was a combat medic, not a combat specialist. But her brother had taught her to shoot when she was 14, standing in their uncle's backyard with a rusty .22, and she had not forgotten. Some lessons you carry in your bones. The first fighter exposed himself for half a second as he moved between cover positions. Half a second was enough. She squeezed the trigger and watched him drop. The second fighter opened up on her position, rounds chewing into the rocks around her, and she pressed herself flat and waited for the gap in his fire that would let her answer. The gap came. She took it. 2 down. But there were more coming. Always more. And somewhere above her, though she did not know it yet, a man who had lost everything was descending into hell to find something worth saving. The sun was beginning its drop toward the western peaks. In 3 hours it would be dark. In the dark, in this valley, against these numbers, she would die. She knew that with the cold clarity that combat brings. 3 hours to live unless something changed. Something was about to change. She just did not know it yet. Yemisi pressed her back against the crumbling wall of the shepherd's hut and forced herself to breathe. The structure was ancient, built from stones that had watched empires rise and fall in this valley, and it smelled like goat dung and old smoke. But the walls were thick enough to stop rifle rounds, and right now, that made it the most valuable real estate in Afghanistan. She checked her ammunition. 1 full magazine. 1 partial. 43 rounds between her and whatever came next. She had been trained to make every shot count, but 43 rounds against an enemy that multiplied like shadows at dusk was not a fight. It was a math problem with only one answer. Her hands were still slick with Brennan's blood. She wiped them on her trousers and felt the weight of his dog tags in her pocket. She would get them home. She would get herself home. She would look Staff Sergeant Ronan Cawley in the eyes and ask him why, and then she would watch him answer for it. But first she had to survive the next 3 hours. The hut had 1 window facing east and a doorway facing south. She positioned herself where she could see both, her rifle ready, her mind running calculations. The Taliban would probe first, test her position, figure out how many defenders she had. When they realized she was alone, they would rush her from multiple angles. That was when her 43 rounds would become meaningless. She thought about Chitty, her little brother who was supposed to be the one who made it out. Their parents had sacrificed everything to come to America, working double shifts at jobs that broke their bodies, saving every dollar so their children could have chances they never had. Chitty was going to be a doctor. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Then one Tuesday evening he walked to the corner store for milk and never came home. Yemisi had found him before the ambulance arrived, held his hand while the blood pooled beneath him on the sidewalk, watched his eyes go glassy and empty while sirens wailed in the distance. Always too late, always too far away. She was 20 years old, pre-med at Berkeley, and in that moment she understood something fundamental about the world. Help has not come. You become the help, or you watch people die. She dropped out the next semester, walked into a Marine recruiter's office, and told them she wanted to save lives in the worst places on Earth. They made her a combat medic and sent her to the Korengal Valley, and for 11 months she had done exactly what she promised herself she would do. She had carried wounded Marines through fire. She had held pressure on arterial bleeds while helicopters fought through enemy fire to reach them. She had saved 19 lives by her own count. 19 families who would see their sons and daughters again because Corporal Yemisi Adeyemi refused to let them go. Now her own people had let her go, left her to die in a riverbed because of something she had seen 3 weeks ago, something she had not yet reported, something Staff Sergeant Cawley knew she could never forget. A sound from outside snapped her back to the present, movement on the rocks to the south. She raised her rifle and waited. 400 meters up the goat trail, Declan Vance moved like water over stone. 15 years of special operations training had taught him how to become invisible, how to cross terrain without leaving traces, how to kill without sound. The Navy had taken those skills away from him on paper. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge. The official record said he had cracked under pressure, disobeyed a direct order, compromised a mission. The official record was a lie constructed by men with stars on their shoulders and blood on their hands. The truth was simpler. His commanding officer had ordered him to execute 4 unarmed Afghan detainees. Farmers, probably. Maybe not. It did not matter. They were bound, blindfolded, and kneeling in the dirt, and Lieutenant Commander Ashworth wanted them dead because dead men could not tell stories about what happened in a village that was never supposed to be raided. Vance had refused. Not quietly, not diplomatically. He had put himself between Ashworth and those men and told his commanding officer that if anyone was going to die that day, it would be the man giving unlawful orders. Ashworth backed down. The detainees were released. And 3 weeks later, Declan Vance found himself standing before a military tribunal, facing charges of insubordination, conduct unbecoming, and failure to obey a direct order. Ashworth had friends in high places. Vance had nothing but his conscience and his service record, and in the end, his conscience cost him everything. 6 of his teammates testified against him, not because they believed he was wrong, but because Ashworth made it clear that loyalty had a price and disloyalty had a higher one. Vance watched men he had bled with, men whose lives he had saved, look him in the eye and lie. And when the verdict came down, when they stripped his trident and marched him out of the courtroom, he had felt something inside himself go dark and cold. 3 years. 3 years of contract work in the same theater where he had once been a warrior. 3 years of watching other men do the job he was born to do while he hauled cargo and checked perimeters and pretended that none of it mattered anymore. But it didn't matter. It mattered right now, as he watched a lone Marine fight for her life against impossible odds because someone with rank and authority had decided she was inconvenient. He reached a rocky outcropping that overlooked the first Taliban observation post. 2 men, poorly concealed, watching the approaches to the shepherd's hut. They were focused on the valley floor, not the ridge above. Amateur mistake. The kind of mistake that got men killed. Vance settled into position, controlled his breathing, and put the crosshairs on the first target. He thought about the woman down there. Thought about the look on her face when she realized her squad had abandoned her. Thought about every time someone with power had decided that someone without power was expendable. He squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle coughed once, and the first Taliban fighter dropped without a sound. His partner turned, confused, reaching for his radio, and Vance sent a second round through his throat before his hand touched the transmitter. 2 down. More to go. In the shepherd's hut, Yemisi heard something that did not fit the pattern of the afternoon. A sound like a heavy book dropping. Then another. Then silence. She waited, rifle raised, pulse steady, wondering if the valley was playing tricks on her. She did not know it yet, but help was coming. Not the kind that arrived in helicopters with medics and extraction teams. Something older. Something more dangerous. The kind of help that came from a man who had lost everything except the one thing that mattered most. The will to do what was right, even when the world had punished him for it. Commander Farid Massoud received the radio transmission in the ruins of a Soviet-era outpost 4 kilometers north of the ambush site. His men had sprung the trap perfectly. 1 American dead, 1 squad scattered and running, and a lone survivor pinned down in the kill zone. A textbook operation, exactly as he had planned it. But something was wrong. 2 of his observation teams had gone silent. No response to radio checks. No gunfire to explain their absence. Just silence where there should have been voices. Massoud was not a man who believed in coincidence. 45 years of life in these mountains had taught him that silence was a language, and right now it was speaking clearly. Someone else was in the valley. Someone his men had not accounted for. He stood at the window of the crumbling outpost and looked south toward the kill zone. The American woman was still alive. His men had confirmed her position in the old shepherd's hut, the one that had belonged to Hamid and his son before the Americans came. Before Staff Sergeant Cawley and his squad kicked down the door and left 2 bodies in the courtyard. Massoud remembered Hamid, a quiet man who raised goats and wanted nothing to do with either side of this war. His son had been 14 years old. Neither of them had ever held a weapon. Neither of them had been a threat to anyone. But the Americans had received bad intelligence, or perhaps no intelligence at all, and they had come in the night with their rifles and their certainty and their absolute conviction that Afghan lies weighed less than American suspicions. Cawley had shot them both. Massoud had heard the story from survivors in a nearby village. The American sergeant had claimed they were reaching for weapons. There were no weapons. There never had been. Now, that same sergeant had abandoned one of his own people in the valley where his crimes had been committed. Massoud found a grim poetry in that. The Americans were eating themselves, destroying their own from the inside. All he had to do was wait and let them finish the job. But the silent observation posts troubled him. He keyed his radio and issued new orders. Send Nazir. Tell him to find out what happened to our eyes in the eastern approach. And send more men to the shepherd's hut. I want that woman taken alive, if possible. Dead, if necessary. But I want her found before dark. At Forward Operating Base Warhorse, 12 kilometers northwest of the kill zone, Sergeant Major Henrietta Polk watched Staff Sergeant Cawley deliver his after-action report and felt the familiar itch at the base of her skull that told her something was very wrong. Cawley stood at attention in her command post, his uniform still dusty from the patrol, his face arranged in an expression of appropriate grief. Corporal Adeyemi was killed in the initial ambush, he said. Heavy enemy fire from multiple positions. We attempted recovery of her body, but were driven back by superior numbers. I made the decision to withdraw to preserve the remaining members of my squad. Polk studied him. 28 years in the Marine Corps had given her an intimate familiarity with the many faces of deception, the way a liar's eyes moved, the micro-expressions that flickered across a face when a mouth spoke words the mind knew to be false. Cawley was good. Better than most, but not good enough. Where exactly did she fall, she asked. Cawley did not hesitate. Grid reference 874-620. The riverbed near the old shepherd's hut. We were caught in a crossfire, moving through the low ground. Polk made a note. The grid reference was specific. Too specific for a chaotic firefight. Men under fire did not remember 8-digit coordinates. They remembered shapes and sounds and the faces of friends dying beside them. Cawley remembered numbers. And Private First Class Brennan, she continued. His body was recovered. Yes, Sergeant Major. Cawley's expression flickered, just for a moment. Corporal Adeyemi was providing aid to Brennan when she was hit. We were able to retrieve him during our withdrawal. So you retrieved Brennan, but not Adeyemi. Brennan was closer to our extraction route. Adeyemi had moved to a more exposed position to treat him. By the time she fell, enemy fire made recovery impossible. Polk let the silence stretch. She had learned long ago that silence was a weapon, that guilty men rushed to fill empty air with explanations and justifications. Cawley held his ground, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his hands that he was trying to control. I will need statements from every member of your squad, she said finally. Individual interviews. Standard procedure for a casualty incident. Something changed in Cawley's eyes. A flash of something cold and calculating that disappeared as quickly as it came. Of course, Sergeant Major. My men will cooperate fully. He was dismissed, and Polk watched him go. Then she pulled up the personnel file for Corporal Yemisi Adeyemi and began to read. Exemplary service record. 19 confirmed saves under fire. Commendations from 3 different commanding officers. Not the kind of Marine who got herself killed through carelessness. Polk reached for her radio and made a call to the intelligence section. She wanted to know everything about that patrol. Every communication, every movement, every decision. Something had happened in that valley, and she was going to find out what. In the rocks east of the shepherd's hut, Declan Vance watched the new group of Taliban fighters moving toward Yemisi's position. 6 men, well-armed, moving with purpose. They had learned from the deaths of their forward observers. They were staying low, using cover, communicating with hand signals instead of radios. Professional, dangerous, and between him and the woman he had come to save. Vance checked his rifle. 8 rounds remaining. He had killed 4 men on his descent, each one a necessary step on the path to that crumbling hut. But 8 rounds would not be enough for 6 targets, not at this range, not with them moving tactically. He needed to get closer. He needed to change the geometry of this fight. And he needed to do it before those 6 men reached Yemisi Adeyemi and finished what her own squad leader had started. He began to move again, flowing through the rocks like a shadow, closing the distance between himself and the kill zone where a woman he had never met was fighting alone against an enemy that did not know a ghost was hunting them. Yemisi saw them coming through the gap in the eastern wall. 6 figures moving through the rocks with the discipline of men who had spent their lives fighting in these mountains. They were not rushing. They were patient, methodical, tightening the noose one careful step at a time. She adjusted her position and steadied her rifle. The first man to show himself clearly would learn that patience worked both ways. The afternoon sun had shifted, throwing long shadows across the riverbed. In another 2 hours, it would begin its descent behind the western peaks, and then the darkness would come. She had heard stories about what happened to American soldiers captured in the Karengal after nightfall. Stories that made death in combat seem like mercy. She would not be captured. She had made that decision the moment she understood what Kali had done. If it came to it, she would save the last round for herself. But she was not ready to make that choice yet. Not while she could still fight. The lead Taliban fighter made his mistake. He rose from cover to signal his team forward, exposing his head and shoulders for just a moment. Yemisi exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped and did not move. Immediately, the others opened fire on her position. Rounds slammed into the stone walls, spraying chips and dust, filling the air with the acrid smell of cordite. She pressed herself flat and waited for the barrage to slow. When it did, she rolled to the window on the opposite side of the hut and caught another fighter trying to flank her position. One shot set her mass. He went down screaming, and his screams told her he was not dead, just wounded. The others would have to choose between pressing the attack and helping their friend. They chose their friend. She heard shouting, movement, the sounds of men dragging a body through the rocks. Then relative silence. 2 more down, but she had expended 4 rounds to do it. Her mathematics were getting worse. 300 meters to the east, Declan Vance watched the engagement through his scope and felt something shift in his chest. The woman was good. Better than good. She was fighting with the cold precision of someone who had accepted the possibility of death and decided to make it expensive. He had known operators like that. Men who went into impossible situations and came out the other side through sheer force of will. They were rare, and they were valuable, and they did not deserve to die alone in forgotten valleys because some coward with rank decided they were inconvenient. Vance moved faster now. The firefight had drawn attention away from the eastern approach, giving him a window to close the distance. He covered 100 meters in 90 seconds, flowing over terrain that would have broken lesser men, his body remembering rhythms that 3 years of exile had not erased. He was 200 meters from the hut when he encountered the first of the flanking team. The fighter emerged from behind a boulder without warning, close enough that Vance could see the surprise in his eyes. There was no time for rifles. Vance dropped his weapon on its sling and closed the distance before the man could raise his AK. His knife was in his hand without conscious thought, and then it was in the fighter's throat, and then the man was on the ground, making sounds that would stop in a few seconds. Vance retrieved his rifle and kept moving. Behind him, another ghost joined the tally of the dead. At FOB Warhorse, Lance Corporal Tomas Delgado sat on his rack and stared at the wall and tried to make sense of what he had done. He had run. When Kali gave the order to fall back, Delgado had run like all the others. He had heard Adeyemi screaming on the radio, heard her begging for support, and he had kept running because that was what Marines did when their squad leader gave an order. They followed. They trusted. They believed that the man in charge knew something they did not. But Kali had known nothing except his own fear. Delgado understood that now. He had seen the look in the staff sergeant's eyes when Adeyemi stayed with Brennan. Not concern, not tactical calculation. Relief. The kind of relief a man feels when a problem solves itself. Delgado thought about his mother in El Paso. She had raised 4 children alone after his father died, working 2 jobs, never complaining, teaching her kids that honor was the only thing worth keeping. She would be ashamed of him now, ashamed of her son, the coward who left a fellow Marine to die. The door to the barracks opened, and Cawley stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and looked at Delgado with eyes that held no warmth. "Sergeant Major Polk is going to interview the squad individually," Cawley said. "She's asking questions about the ambush. About Adeyemi." Delgado said nothing. Cawley moved closer. His voice dropped to something between a whisper and a threat. "You were there, Delgado. You saw what happened. Adeyemi was hit in the initial contact. We could not recover her body. That is the truth, and that is what you're going to tell the sergeant major." Still Delgado did not speak. But something in his expression must have given him away, because Cawley's face hardened. "I know about your mother," Cawley said. "I know about your sisters. San Antonio, right? Nice neighborhood. It would be a shame if something happened to them while you were deployed on the other side of the world. A real tragedy." Delgado felt the words hit him like physical blows. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to grab Cawley by the throat and slam him against the wall and make him answer for every lie he had told. But the images were already forming in his mind. His mother's face, his little sisters, the knowledge that men like Cawley had connections that stretched far beyond this base, this valley, this war. "Do we understand each other?" Cawley asked. Delgado's voice came out hollow and broken. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "Good." Cawley straightened his uniform and moved toward the door. "Remember, Delgado, we are all brothers here. We all have each other's backs. That is what makes us Marines." He left, and Delgado sat in the silence and felt something inside himself begin to crack. He thought about Adeyemi out there in that valley, alone, fighting for her life while he sat here and did nothing. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be and the kind of man he was becoming, and he wondered if there was still time to choose. Yemisi's hands were shaking, not from fear, though fear was there, coiled in her gut like a living thing. The shaking came from exhaustion, from dehydration, from the slow drain of adrenaline that had been flooding her system for hours. Her body was beginning to fail her, and she could not afford to let it. She pulled her canteen from her belt and allowed herself 3 small sips. The water was warm and tasted like plastic, but it steadied her hands enough to check her ammunition again. 31 rounds. She had killed 4 men and spent 12 bullets doing it. The math was still bad, but she was still alive, and right now, that was the only equation that mattered. The Taliban fighters had pulled back after her last engagement. Regrouping. Waiting. They knew she was alone now. They had tested her defenses and found them lethal, but limited. All they had to do was wait for darkness or reinforcements, whichever came first. She needed to move. Staying in the hut was a death sentence, a fixed position that would eventually be overwhelmed. But moving meant crossing open ground, exposing herself to fighters who knew this terrain far better than she did. Every option was bad. She just had to find the least bad one. That was when she noticed the radio. It sat in the corner of the hut, half buried under a pile of old blankets and debris. Soviet-era equipment, bulky and outdated, the kind of thing that should have stopped working decades ago. But the Afghans were masters of keeping old technology alive, and when Yemisi brushed away the dust, she saw that the power light was glowing a faint amber. She pulled the radio free and examined it. The casing was cracked, the antenna bent at an odd angle, but the internals seemed intact. She turned the dial slowly, searching for frequencies, and was rewarded with static and fragments of distant voices. Most of it was Pashto, Taliban communications she could not understand. But then she caught something else. English. American accents. The familiar cadence of military radio traffic. She adjusted the dial carefully, trying to lock onto the signal. The voice became clearer, and she recognized it immediately. Staff Sergeant Ronan Cawley, reporting to someone at the FOB. Confirmed Kia, Cawley was saying. Corporal Adeyemi was killed in action during the ambush. Body unrecoverable due to enemy activity. Recommend we mark her status and move on. No point risking more lives for remains we cannot retrieve. Yemisi felt the words hit her like rounds to the chest. She had suspected. From the moment the squad left her behind, she had known that something was wrong beyond simple cowardice. But hearing it confirmed, hearing Kali pronounce her dead with such casual certainty, transformed suspicion into something harder. Something that burned. He had not just abandoned her. He had erased her, declared her dead so that no one would come looking. So that when the Taliban finally overran her position, there would be no rescue mission, no investigation, no questions about why a Marine was left alone in a kill zone. She would simply be another casualty of war, another name on a wall, another family destroyed by a conflict that had already taken too much. The transmission continued. She heard another voice, one she did not recognize, asking questions about the patrol route and the enemy positions. Kali answered smoothly, confidently, spinning a version of events that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. He was good at lying. He had probably been good at it his entire life. Yemisi thought about the village 3 weeks ago, the night patrol that had gone wrong in ways she still did not fully understand. She had been treating a wounded Marine in the courtyard when she heard the shots from inside the house. 2 shots close together. When she ran inside, she found Kali standing over 2 bodies. An old man and a teenage boy. Neither of them armed. Neither of them a threat. Kali had looked at her with something cold in his eyes. They were reaching for weapons, he said. You saw it. They were reaching for weapons. She had not seen it because it had not happened, but she had not reported it either. She had told herself she needed more information, more evidence, more certainty before she destroyed a man's career with an accusation. She had told herself there would be time to figure out the right thing to do. Now she understood that Kali had been figuring out the right thing to do as well. And his solution was simpler than hers. Dead witnesses do not testify. The radio crackled again, and she heard Kali sign off. Then silence. She sat in the ruins of the shepherd's hut, surrounded by the ghosts of the old man and his son, and felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders. She was alone. She was declared dead. No one was coming to save her. 200 meters away, Declan Vance pressed himself against a rock face and tried to control his breathing. The knife wound on his forearm was deeper than he had realized. Blood was seeping through the field dressing he had applied, and his grip strength was compromised. He had maybe 70% function in his left hand, which meant his shooting would suffer, which meant the margin for error had just gotten smaller. He had killed 6 men on his descent into the valley. 6 lives ended so that he could reach a woman he had never met. He did not feel guilt about that. He had stopped feeling guilt about killing a long time ago. What he felt was the cold calculus of combat, the understanding that every bullet spent and every wound taken brought him closer to a threshold he might not be able to cross. But he kept moving, because 200 meters ahead, through the scope of his rifle, he could see her. The Marine in the shepherd's hut. Still alive. Still fighting. And as long as she was fighting, he would fight too. The sun was lower now. Maybe 90 minutes until dark. 90 minutes to reach her, to get her out, to find a way through the Taliban cordon that was tightening around them both. 90 minutes to prove that he was still the man he used to be. He checked his rifle. 5 rounds remaining. Then the pistol. Then the knife. Then his hands. It would have to be enough. The first shot came from nowhere. One moment Yemisi was scanning the rocks to the south. The next, a Taliban fighter 50 meters to her east was falling backward with a hole in his chest. She had not pulled the trigger. She had not even seen the man until he was already dead. Another shot. Another body dropping. This one closer, a fighter who had been working his way toward her blind side. He crumpled without a sound, and Yemisi felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Someone was out there. Someone with a rifle and the skills to use it. Someone who was killing the men, trying to kill her. She pressed herself against the wall of the hut and tried to process what was happening. Friendly forces did not operate alone in the Korengal. Air support would have announced itself. A quick reaction force would have come with helicopters and overwhelming firepower. This was something else. Something she could not explain. A third shot echoed across the valley, and a third fighter died. The remaining Taliban broke discipline, scrambling for cover, shouting to each other in panicked Pashto. They had come to kill a lone woman, and now they were being hunted by a ghost they could not see. Yemisi made a decision. Whoever was out there had just given her an opening, and she was not going to waste it. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the doorway of the hut, scanning for threats. The path to the east was clear for the first time in hours. If she moved now, fast and low, she might be able to reach better ground before the Taliban regrouped. She ran. The rocks tore at her knees as she scrambled up the slope, but she did not slow down. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the crack of rifle fire, the sounds of men dying. Whoever her mysterious ally was, they were keeping the enemy occupied. She covered 50 meters, then 100, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, her mind focused on nothing but the next handhold and the next step. She was almost to the ridgeline when a figure emerged from the rocks ahead of her. Her rifle came up automatically, finger finding the trigger, every instinct screaming at her to shoot. But something stopped her. The figure was not dressed like Taliban. The weapon he carried was not an AK, and his eyes, pale blue and steady, held no threat. He spoke first. His voice was calm, almost gentle, completely at odds with the violence that surrounded them. "Corporal Adeyemi, my name is Declan Vance. I'm here to help you." Yemisi kept her rifle raised. "How do you know my name? I watched your squad leave you behind. I saw what happened, and I have been working my way down to you ever since." She studied him, the blood on his sleeve, the suppressed rifle in his hands, the way he held himself, balanced and ready, like a man who had spent his life in places where hesitation meant death. He was not military, not anymore. The beard and the civilian clothes told her that much. But everything else about him screamed operator. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Former Navy SEAL. Team 4. Discharged 3 years ago. I work private security now. I was running convoy protection when I saw the ambush." "Discharged for what?" Something flickered in his eyes. "Pay, maybe. Or shame. For refusing to follow an order that would have made me a murderer." Yemisi lowered her rifle slowly. She did not trust him, not completely. But she understood him. She understood what it meant to be destroyed by your own people for trying to do the right thing. "Kali left me to die," she said. "He reported me as Kia. No one is coming for me." Vance nodded. "I know. I heard the radio traffic." He paused, looking back toward the kill zone where Taliban fighters were still scrambling for cover. "That is why I came. Because no one else was going to." Below them, Commander Massoud stood in the shadow of a boulder and watched the chaos unfolding among his men. He had lost 8 fighters in the last 10 minutes, picked off by a shooter he could not locate. The American woman had escaped her position in the confusion, and now his carefully planned operation was falling apart. He raised his binoculars and scanned the ridgeline. There, 2 figures, moving together, climbing toward the high ground. The woman and someone else. A man he did not recognize. A man who moved like a predator. Massoud had fought Americans for 15 years. He had learned their tactics, their weaknesses, their patterns. But this man was different. This man did not fight like a soldier following orders. He fought like something older, something more dangerous. Massoud keyed his radio and issued new orders. "All units converge on the eastern ridge. I want every fighter we have moving to cut off their escape. And send word to the villages. I want reinforcements. As many as we can gather." He lowered the radio and continued watching the 2 figures climb. The woman was a problem that should have been solved hours ago. The man was a complication he had not anticipated. Together, they were a threat that required his full attention. On the ridge above, Yemisi and Vance reached a small plateau that offered cover and a clear view of the valley below. They had maybe 60 minutes until sunset. After that, the advantage would shift to the Taliban, who knew these mountains in the dark better than any American ever could. Vance checked his rifle. 2 rounds remaining. His pistol had a full magazine, plus 1 in the chamber. 14 shots total. Not enough for what was coming. He looked at Yemisi. "How many rounds do you have?" She checked her own weapon. 27. He nodded slowly. "We need to find a defensible position, somewhere we can hold until morning. If we survive the night, I have a contact who can arrange extraction. And if we do not survive the night..." Vance met her eyes. Then we make them pay for every inch of ground. Yemisi felt something shift inside her. For hours she had been fighting alone, convinced that she would die alone, another forgotten casualty in a forgotten war. But now there was someone beside her, someone who had risked everything to reach her, someone who understood what it meant to be betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. She did not know if they would survive the night, but she knew they would face it together. And right now, that was enough. They found the cave as the sun touched the western peaks. It was not much, just a shallow depression in the rock face hidden behind a tumble of boulders, but it offered cover from 3 directions and a clear field of fire to the east. In terrain like this, that was as close to a fortress as they were going to get. Vance moved inside first, checking corners with the instincts of a man who had cleared 1,000 rooms in a dozen countries. When he was satisfied, he signaled Yemisi forward. She slipped through the gap in the boulders and felt the temperature drop as the rock walls closed around her. Cool air, darkness, safety, or at least the illusion of it. They had perhaps 40 minutes of usable light remaining. Vance used the time to check their supplies. His assessment was grim. 2 rifle rounds, 14 pistol rounds, 27 rounds in her M4. Her med kit, mostly depleted from treating Brennan. His knife, her knife, 2 canteens of water between them. Not enough, Yemisi said. Vance shook his head. Not nearly enough. But we work with what we have. He moved to the cave entrance and began arranging rocks to create a low barrier. Not much protection, but enough to force attackers to expose themselves before they could get a clear shot inside. Yemisi joined him, and they worked in silence, building their final defensive position 1 stone at a time. When the barrier was finished, they sat with their backs against the cave wall and watched the light fade over the valley. Somewhere below, Taliban fighters were moving through the shadows, searching for the 2 Americans who had killed so many of their brothers. It was only a matter of time before they found the cave. The only question was whether Vance and Yemisi would be ready when they did. "Why did you come?" Yemisi asked. The question had been burning in her since they met on the ridge. "You do not know me. You had no reason to risk your life." Vance was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. "Because 3 years ago, I needed someone to come for me, and no one did." She waited. He continued. "When they court-martialed me, I kept waiting for one of my teammates to stand up, to tell the truth about what happened. We had been through hell together. I had saved their lives, and they had saved mine. I thought that meant something." He paused, and she could see the old wound in his eyes. "They all testified against me. Every single one. Because the man who gave the order had stars on his collar and friends in Washington, and I had nothing but my conscience." Yemisi thought about Kali, about the way her squad had followed his order without question, about how easy it was to abandon someone when authority told you it was acceptable. "I should have reported him," she said. "After the village. I saw what he did to that old man and his son. I knew it was murder. But I hesitated. I told myself I needed more evidence. More time. And now here I am." Vance turned to look at her. "You hesitated because you wanted to be sure. Because you understood that accusing a man of murder is not something you do lightly. That does not make you a coward. It makes you human. It might get me killed. It might," he agreed. "But you're still here. Still fighting. That counts for something." The last light was fading now, painting the valley in shades of purple and gray. Soon the darkness would be complete, and the hunters would come. Yemisi checked her rifle one more time, more for comfort than necessity. The weight of it in her hands was familiar, reassuring. "Tell me about your brother," Vance said. The question caught her off guard. She had not mentioned Chitty to him, had not spoken about the wound that had driven her into the Marines in the first place. "How did you know about my brother?" "You talked to him," Vance said simply, "when you think no one is listening. On the ridge, when you were catching your breath. You said his name." Yemisi felt something crack inside her. The careful wall she had built around that grief. The armor she wore to keep the world from seeing how broken she still was. For a moment she could not speak. When she found her voice, it came out rough and uneven. His name was Chitty. He was 17. He was going to be a doctor. She stopped, swallowed, forced herself to continue. He went to the store for milk. Just milk. and he never came home. Vance did not offer empty condolences. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. I found him on the sidewalk, she continued. Held his hand while he died. The ambulance took 23 minutes to arrive. 23 minutes. I counted every one of them. She looked at Vance with eyes that held old pain and fresh determination. That is why I became a medic, so I could be the one who arrives in time. So other people would not have to count the minutes while someone they love bleeds out in front of them. Vance nodded slowly. He understood. He understood in a way that most people never could. The weight of loss. The drive to make meaning from meaningless tragedy. The need to become something stronger than the thing that broke you. We're going to survive this, he said. And when we do, Colley's going to answer for what he did. To you. To that old man and his boy. To everyone he has ever betrayed. Yemisi wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that justice was possible in a world that had shown her so much evidence to the contrary. But she had learned long ago that hope was a luxury, and survival required something harder. And if we do not survive, she asked. Vance checked his pistol and settled into position facing the cave entrance. Then we make sure they remember us. Outside, the darkness was complete. The stars emerged one by one, cold and indifferent, witnesses to a drama that would play out in the shadows below. Somewhere in that darkness, men were coming to kill them. Men who did not know that the two Americans waiting in the cave had already lost everything that could be taken from them. There is a particular kind of danger in fighting someone with nothing left to lose. The Taliban were about to learn that lesson. The night had begun. The first probe came 2 hours after sunset. Yemisi heard them before she saw them. The soft scrape of boots on rock, the whisper of fabric against stone. She counted 3 distinct sounds, 3 separate positions, 3 men working their way up the slope toward the cave. She tapped Vance's arm twice. Their prearranged signal. He shifted into position beside her, pistol raised, eyes scanning the darkness. They had agreed to hold fire until absolutely necessary. Every round was precious. Every shot had to count. The lead fighter appeared at the edge of their field of fire, a shadow moving against slightly lighter shadows. He was good, moving low and quiet, but he did not know exactly where they were. He was searching, probing, trying to draw fire that would reveal their position. Yemisi held her breath. The fighter moved closer, 5 meters from the cave entrance, then 4, then 3. She could see the outline of his weapon now, the shape of his head. One shot would end him, but one shot would also tell the others exactly where to aim. The fighter paused. He was looking directly at the cave, directly at the gap in the boulders where Yemisi and Vance were hidden. For a terrible moment, she was certain he had seen them, certain he was about to raise his rifle and send rounds tearing through their fragile shelter. Then a voice called out from below. Pashto words she did not understand. The fighter turned and retreated down the slope, melting back into the darkness as silently as he had come. They know we are here, Vance whispered. They are just not sure exactly where. That probe was meant to flush us out. Yemisi released her breath slowly. What happens when they get tired of probing? They come in force, probably just before dawn. They will want enough light to see, but they will not want to give us a full day to prepare. So we have until dawn. Vance nodded in the darkness. We have until dawn. At FOB Warhorse, Sergeant Major Henrietta Polk sat in her office and stared at the inconsistencies spread across her desk. Patrol reports, radio logs, personnel files, the pieces of a puzzle that did not fit together no matter how she arranged them. Colley's story was clean. Too clean. Every detail accounted for, every timeline precise, every witness statement perfectly aligned. In 28 years of service, Polk had learned that real combat was messy. Real memories were fragmented and contradictory. When a story was this neat, it meant someone had taken the time to construct it. She pulled up the radio logs from the ambush. Colley's transmissions were recorded, time-stamped, official. Fall back to extraction point. Kopodan ademikia. Body unrecoverable. Standard language, standard procedure. But there was another transmission, one that had been logged by a relay station 12 kilometers south. A woman's voice, desperate and clear. Negative, I have a critical casualty. Need suppressive fire for evac. The timestamp showed that transmission came 47 seconds after Kali ordered the retreat. 47 seconds during which Adeyemi was still alive, still calling for help, still fighting. Polk felt something cold settle in her chest. She had seen corruption before, seen men abuse their authority, betray their oaths, sacrifice others to protect themselves. But this was different. This was murder dressed in the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. She reached for her radio and called the duty officer. "Wake up Lance Corporal Delgado. Tell him I want to see him in my office." Now, in the barracks, Delgado heard the knock on his door and felt his stomach drop. He had been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when Kali's squad had left Adeyemi behind. He could still hear her voice on the radio, could still feel the weight of his rifle as he ran in the wrong direction. He opened the door to find a corporal with a flashlight and hard eyes. "Sergeant Major wants you." Now, Delgado followed him through the darkened base, past sleeping quarters and silent vehicles, to the command building where Polk's light was the only one burning. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. In a way, he supposed he was. Polk was waiting for him. She did not offer him a seat. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen every lie a man could tell and said 4 words. "Tell me what happened." Delgado opened his mouth to recite the story Kali had drilled into him. The story that protected everyone, that kept his family safe, that let him sleep at night. But the words would not come. He thought about his mother, about his sisters, about the threat Kali had made. And then he thought about Yemisi Adeyemi, alone in that valley, fighting for her life because men like him had chosen cowardice over honor. "Staff Sergeant," he began, then stopped, started again. "Staff Sergeant Kali ordered us to fall back, while Corporal Adeyemi was still providing aid to Private Brennan. She was calling for support on the radio. She was begging us to help her." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was barely a whisper. "We left her. We left her there to die." Polk's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Continue." It all came out then. The retreat that was not tactical but deliberate. Kali's refusal to answer Adeyemi's radio calls. The look on his face when he realized she was trapped. The threats he had made afterward to ensure silence. When Delgado finished, Polk was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her radio and began issuing orders. Her voice was calm, controlled, deadly. "I want Staff Sergeant Kali detained immediately. I want a quick reaction force assembled and ready to deploy at first light. And I want every helicopter we have fueled and armed." She looked at Delgado, and for the first time, her expression softened. "You did the right thing, Lance Corporal. It took you too long, but you did it." Delgado felt tears burning in his eyes. Is she still alive out there? Polk turned toward the window, toward the mountains that held so many secrets. "I do not know, but we're going to find out." In the cave on the ridge, Yemisi and Vance heard the sounds of movement below. More voices now, more fighters gathering in the darkness. The Taliban were massing for the assault that would come with the dawn. Vance checked his weapons one final time. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "it has been an honor." Yemisi looked at him. This man who had given up everything to save a stranger. This ghost who had found something worth haunting. "The honor is mine," she replied. They settled into position, shoulder to shoulder, and waited for the dawn that would decide everything. The first light of dawn crept over the eastern mountains like a wound opening in the sky. Red and orange bleeding into purple, the colors of violence painted across the heavens. Yemisi watched it come and felt the strange calm that settles over soldiers in the moments before everything changes. They came with the light. Shadows separating from shadows, figures emerging from the rocks below, too many to count in the dim glow of early morning. She saw rifles, saw movement on 3 sides, saw the tactical discipline of men who had rehearsed this assault in the darkness. Vance fired first. His pistol barked twice, and 2 fighters dropped on the eastern approach. Then Yemisi opened up. Her M4 spitting controlled bursts into the mass of bodies climbing toward them. She saw men fall, saw others take their place, saw the wave of humanity crashing against the rocks like water against a cliff. The noise was overwhelming. Gunfire echoing off stone, shouts in Pashto, the crack of rounds striking the boulders around them. A bullet whined past her ear, close enough to feel the heat. Another struck the rock beside her head and sprayed her face with fragments. She did not flinch. She did not stop firing. Vance was a machine beside her. Every shot precise, every movement economical. He shifted positions constantly, never staying in one place long enough to give the enemy a fixed target. His pistol clicked empty, and he transitioned to his rifle, 2 rounds remaining, and he made them count. 2 more bodies on the slope. Then his rifle was empty too, and he drew his knife. Yemisi burned through her magazine and slammed in her last one. 17 rounds. 17 chances to stay alive. She made each one matter, picking her targets with the cold precision that combat demands. But for every fighter who fell, 2 more appeared. The math was impossible. The outcome was inevitable. A grenade arced through the air and landed short of the cave entrance. The explosion showered them with dirt and debris, and Yemisi felt something hot slice across her thigh. She looked down and saw blood soaking through her trousers, a fragment wound, painful but not fatal. She kept firing. 10 rounds, then 5. Then 3. Her rifle clicked empty on a fighter who was 10 meters away and closing fast. She dropped the weapon and drew her pistol, put 2 rounds in his chest, watched him crumple. Behind him came another, and she understood that this was the end. She had nothing left. No ammunition, no options, nothing but the knife on her belt and the determination to take as many of them with her as she could. Then she heard it. A sound that cut through the chaos of battle like a blade through flesh. The heavy thump of helicopter rotors. She looked up and saw them coming over the ridge. 2 Black Hawks, Doorgunners already firing, their miniguns tearing into the Taliban positions with devastating effect. Behind them came a 3rd helicopter, a medevac bird with a red cross on its side. And behind that, she could see more aircraft, a full air assault element descending on the valley like the wrath of God. The effect on the Taliban was immediate. Men who had been charging forward moments ago, now scattered, diving for cover, trying to escape the rain of fire pouring down from above. The assault collapsed into chaos, discipline breaking under the weight of overwhelming firepower. Vance grabbed Yemisi's arm and pulled her deeper into the cave as round from the helicopters chewed up the ground outside. They pressed against the back wall and watched through the gap in the boulders as the rescue force dismantled the enemy that had almost killed them. It was over in minutes. The Taliban fighters who survived melted into the mountains, disappearing into terrain they knew better than anyone. The helicopters circled overhead, searching for stragglers, while one of the Black Hawks settled onto a flat stretch of rock 50 meters from a cave. Marines poured out of the aircraft, moving with purpose, securing the perimeter. Yemisi recognized the insignia on their uniforms. Quick Reaction Force. Someone had sent help after all. A figure emerged from the helicopter and strode toward the cave with the bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding respect. Sergeant Major Henrietta Polk. Her face was hard, her eyes scanning the carnage around her, taking in the bodies on the slope and the 2 survivors in the cave. Corporal Adeyemi, she called out. You in there? Yemisi stepped forward into the light, limping on her wounded leg, covered in blood and dirt and the residue of a night spent fighting for her life. She came to attention as best she could and answered. Yes, Sergeant Major. I am here. Polk's expression did not soften, but something in her eyes shifted. Something that might have been respect. You look like hell, Corporal. Yemisi almost laughed. It has been a long night, Sergeant Major. Polk turned her attention to Vance, who had emerged from the cave behind Yemisi. He stood there in his civilian clothes, his weapons empty, his body battered, looking like exactly what he was. A ghost who had refused to stay dead. And who the hell are you? Polk demanded. Vance met her gaze without flinching. Just a contractor, Sergeant Major. I was in the area. Polk studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. You and are going to have a conversation later. Contractor. A long one. Looking forward to it. Medics rushed forward, and Yemisi fell hands, guiding her toward the waiting helicopter. She looked back at the cave, at the rocks where she and Vance had made their stand, at the bodies of the men who had tried to kill them. She thought about everything she had survived in the last 24 hours. The betrayal, the abandonment, the long night of waiting for death that never came. She thought about Kali and what waited for him back at the FOB. Sergeant Major, she said as the medics helped her into the helicopter. Staff Sergeant Kali, there are things you need to know. Poke climbed in beside her and settled into the seat opposite. I know, she said. Lance Corporal Delgado told me everything. Kali is already in custody. He is not going to hurt anyone else. Yemisi felt something release inside her. A tension she had been carrying for weeks, maybe months. The weight of a secret that had nearly gotten her killed. There's more, she said. The shepherd's hut where I took cover. It belonged to two people Kali murdered. An old man and his son. I witnessed it 3 weeks ago. That is why he left me to die. Poke's face hardened into something cold and dangerous. Then you're going to tell me everything, Corporal. Every detail. And when you're done, I'm going to personally ensure that Staff Sergeant Ronan Kali spends the rest of his life in a cell. The helicopter lifted off, and Yemisi watched the valley fall away beneath her. Somewhere down there, scattered among the rocks, were the bodies of men who had died trying to kill her. And somewhere in that same valley, the ghosts of an old man and his son could finally rest. Justice was coming. It had taken too long, cost too much, but it was coming. The field hospital at FOB Warhorse was a controlled chaos of activity when the medevac touched down. Yemisi was lifted onto a stretcher and rushed inside, medics cutting away her blood-soaked trousers to examine the fragment wound in her thigh. The pain hit her then, the adrenaline finally fading, and she gritted her teeth against the urge to scream. Vance walked in under his own power, though barely. His wounded arm had opened up again during the fight, and his face was gray with blood loss. A medic tried to guide him to a bed, but he shook off the help and positioned himself where he could see Yemisi. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence said everything. The wound was clean, a medic told Yemisi as he worked. Fragment went through the muscle, missed the artery. You're lucky, Corporal. Another inch to the left, and you would have bled out on that mountain. Lucky, Yemisi repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth. She did not feel lucky. She felt hollowed out, scraped raw, held together by nothing but stubbornness and the knowledge that the man who tried to kill her was finally going to answer for it. Across the base, in a holding cell normally reserved for enemy combatants, Staff Sergeant Ronan Kali sat on a concrete bench and stared at the wall. He had been there for 6 hours. No one had spoken to him. No one had explained the charges. He had simply been pulled from his rack in the middle of the night by military police who refused to meet his eyes. He knew what had happened. The moment he saw the MPs at his door, he understood that his carefully constructed story had collapsed. Delgado, probably. The kid had always been weak. Too much conscience, not enough survival instinct. Kali had known it was a risk, relying on threats to ensure his silence. He should have found a more permanent solution. But it did not matter now. What mattered was controlling the narrative, finding the angles, identifying who could be pressured and who could be bought. His family had connections. His father had served with generals who now sat on promotion boards. This was not over. It was never over for men like him. The cell door opened, and Sergeant Major Poke stepped inside. She did not sit. She did not offer him the courtesy of pretending this was a conversation between equals. She simply stood there, looking down at him with eyes that held nothing but contempt. Staff Sergeant Kali, she said, you are being charged with dereliction of duty, making false official statements, and conspiracy to commit murder. Additional charges are pending based on the testimony of Corporal Yemisi Adeyemi regarding the deaths of 2 Afghan civilians. Kali kept his face neutral. I want to speak to a lawyer. You will get one. But first, I want you to understand something. Poke leaned closer, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. I have been a Marine for 28 years. I have seen men do terrible things in the name of survival, in the name of fear, in the name of protecting their brothers. I have seen good men break and bad men flourish. But I have never seen anything quite like you. She straightened up. You left one of your own Marines to die. You reported her killed to prevent rescue. You murdered 2 unarmed civilians and then tried to eliminate the only witness. And you did all of it while wearing the same uniform that good men and women have died to honor. Colley said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Polk's shoulder. Your father's connections will not save you, Polk continued. Your family name will not protect you. By the time this is over, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you are, and you will spend the rest of your life in a cell thinking about the people you destroyed. She turned and walked out, leaving Colley alone with the weight of everything he had done. In the field hospital, Yemisi was drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard voices at the entrance. She opened her eyes to see Delgado standing at the foot of her bed, his face a mask of guilt and shame and something that might have been hope. "Corporal," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have refused the order. I should have stayed with you." Yemisi looked at him, this young Marine who had run when he should have fought, who had stayed silent when he should have spoken. She thought about all the ways she could respond, the anger she could unleash, the condemnation he probably deserved. But she also thought about herself 3 weeks ago, standing in that courtyard, watching Colley lie about what he had done. She had stayed silent too. She had told herself she needed more time, more evidence, more certainty. She had made the same choice Delgado made, just in a different moment. "You came forward," she said finally. "When it mattered, you told the truth." Delgado's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid. He threatened my family, my mother, my sisters. I did not know what to do." "Fear is not the sin," Yemisi said. "Staying silent is. You did not stay silent. That is what matters now." She reached out and took his hand. He gripped it like a drowning man gripping a lifeline, and she felt something pass between them. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness would take time, but understanding. The recognition that they had both been broken by the same man, and they had both found their way back to something like honor. Across the room, Vance watched the exchange from his bed. A medic was stitching his arm, but his attention was on Yemisi, on the grace she showed to a man who had abandoned her, on the strength it took to offer understanding instead of condemnation. He thought about his own teammates, the men who had testified against him 3 years ago. He had never forgiven them, had never even considered it. But watching Yemisi now, he wondered if forgiveness was less about them and more about him. Less about excusing what they did and more about releasing the weight of carrying it. The medic finished the last stitch and stepped back. "You should rest," she said. "You have lost a lot of blood." Vance nodded, but did not close his eyes. He kept watching Yemisi, kept thinking about the woman who had fought beside him through the longest night of his life. She was going to be fine. She was going to testify against Colley and see justice done. She was going to return to her unit and continue saving lives. And he was going to disappear back into the shadows, back to the convoys and the contracts and the empty existence he had built for himself. Unless he chose differently. Unless he finally stopped running from who he used to be. 3 days passed at FOB Warhorse. 3 days of debriefings and statements and the slow, grinding machinery of military justice. Yemisi told her story a dozen times to a dozen different officers, each one writing notes, asking questions, building the case that would destroy Ronan Colley. She told them about the village, about the old man named Hamid and his 14-year-old son, about the sound of 2 gunshots in the darkness and the bodies she found when she ran inside. She told them about Colley's eyes when he looked at her, the cold calculation, the implicit threat. She told them about the ambush in the kill zone, about the radio calls that went unanswered, about the moment she understood that her own squad leader had left her die. By the time she finished, there was enough evidence to convene a general court-martial. Colley would face charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment. His military career was over. His freedom was about to follow. On the 3rd evening, Yemisi walked out of the command building and found Vance waiting for her. He was leaning against a concrete barrier, his wounded arm in a sling, his eyes scanning the base with the automatic vigilance of a man who had spent his life in dangerous places. She walked over and stood beside him. They did not speak for a long moment, just watched the sun sink toward the mountains that had almost become their grave. "I heard you're shipping out tomorrow," Vance said finally. Yemisi nodded. "Back to Lejeune. Medical evaluation, then administrative leave while the investigation continues. They want me available to testify when Kali goes to trial." "Good. He deserves everything that is coming to him." She turned to look at Vance. "And what about you? Where do you go from here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Back to the convoys, I suppose. Back to pretending that running security for supply trucks is enough to keep me from thinking about everything I used to be." "Is it enough?" Vance shook his head slowly. "No, it has never been enough. But it was all I had." Yemisi reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She had written it that morning, sitting on her hospital bed, thinking about the man who had saved her life. "Sergeant Major Polk gave me this," she said, handing it to him. "She thought you should see it." Vance unfolded the paper and read. His expression did not change, but she saw something shift in his eyes, something that had been dead for 3 years flickering back to life. The document was a summary of an investigation. 3 years old, classified until recently when someone with enough authority had decided to unseal it. It described an incident in a village that did not officially exist, involving orders that were never officially given. It named Lieutenant Commander Theodore Ashworth as the subject of the investigation. It described testimony from 4 Afghan civilians who had been released by a Navy SEAL who refused to execute them. The investigation had been buried. Ashworth's connections had ensured that. But the evidence remained, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for the right moment to surface. "Polk made some calls," Yemisi said. "Turns out your commanding officer has made some enemies over the years. People who remember what he did. People who have been waiting for a chance to bring him down." Vance looked up from the document. His voice was rough. "This does not change what happened to me. The discharge, the court-martial, the men who testified against me. No," Yemisi agreed. "It does not change any of that. But it might give you a chance to set the record straight, to tell your story to people who are finally ready to listen." Vance folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He stared at the mountains for a long time, and Yemisi could see the battle playing out behind his eyes. The fear of hope, the weight of 3 years spent believing that justice was impossible, the terrifying possibility that he might finally get the redemption he had stopped allowing himself to want. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Yemisi thought about the question, thought about the night in the cave, the stories they had shared, the understanding that had formed between 2 people who had both been destroyed by the institutions they served. "Because you came for me," she said simply, "when no one else would, when you had every reason to walk away. You came down that mountain, and you fought beside me, and you never once asked for anything in return." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "You spent 3 years believing that no one would ever fight for you. I want you to know that is not true anymore." Vance turned to look at her. In the fading light, his pale blue eyes held something she had not seen before. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. The first crack in a wall that had been solid for 3 years. "I do not know how to be that person anymore," he said. "The SEAL, the operator, the man I was before they took everything from me." "Then do not be that person," Yemisi replied. "Be someone new. Someone who knows what it means to lose everything and still choose to do the right thing." She smiled slightly. "That is who you were on that mountain. That is who you have always been. You just forgot for a while." Vance was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. The hard lines softened. The guarded expression eased. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years and was finally allowing himself to exhale. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he could not say. Yemisi reached out and took his hand. They stood there as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, 2 warriors who had found each other in the darkest place imaginable. 2 survivors who had taught each other that broken things could still have value, that people who had lost everything could still find something worth fighting for. Tomorrow she would fly back to the States. Tomorrow he would begin the long process of reclaiming his name. Tomorrow they would return to their separate lives, forever changed by a single day in a valley that had tried to kill them both. But tonight they stood together, and that was enough. 3 months later, Yemisi stood in the hallway outside Courtroom 4 at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune and tried to steady her breathing. Through the heavy wooden doors, she could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of bodies, the weight of anticipation that filled the room where Staff Sergeant Ronan Cauley would learn his fate. She had testified 2 days ago, had looked Cauley in the eyes and told the court everything. The village, the murders, the abandonment in the kill zone, the radio calls he refused to answer. She had watched his face as she spoke, searching for some sign of remorse, some flicker of humanity beneath the mask he wore. She found nothing, just the same cold calculation she had seen that night in the courtyard, standing over 2 bodies that had done nothing to deserve their deaths. The doors opened, and a Marine in dress blues gestured for her to enter. The verdict was in. She walked into the courtroom and took her seat in the gallery. The room was packed. Officers, enlisted JAG lawyers, reporters who had caught wind of a story too explosive to ignore. In the front row, she saw the family of Hamid and his son. The old man's wife, dressed in black, her weathered face a map of grief. The boy's older sister, barely 20, who had traveled across the world to see justice done for a brother who would never grow up. Cauley stood at the defense table, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid. He did not turn to look at the gallery. He did not acknowledge the family of his victims or the Marine he had left to die. He simply stared straight ahead, as if none of this was real, as if he was already somewhere else in his mind. The military judge entered, and everyone rose. Then the foreman of the panel stood, a colonel with silver hair and campaign ribbons from 3 wars, and began to read. Guilty of dereliction of duty. Guilty of making false official statements. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Yemisi watched Cauley's face and saw the mask finally crack. Not remorse. Fear. The dawning understanding that his family name and his father's connections could not save him from this. That everything he had done to protect himself had only delayed the inevitable. The sentence came next. Life imprisonment, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction to the lowest enlisted grade. Everything he had built, everything his family had represented for 3 generations, stripped away in a single afternoon. As the MPs led Cauley from the courtroom, he finally looked at Yemisi. Their eyes met for just a moment. She saw hatred there, and beneath it something that might have been envy. She had survived. She had won, and he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, knowing that the woman he tried to destroy had been the instrument of his destruction. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She simply watched him go, and then she turned to the family in the front row. Hamid's wife was weeping silently, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter had an arm around her shoulders, whispering words in Pashto that Yemisi could not understand. But she understood the look in their eyes when they turned to her. Gratitude, recognition, the acknowledgement that a stranger from another country had fought to give them something they never expected to receive. Justice. Yemisi walked over and knelt beside them. She did not have words that could bridge the gap between their worlds. But she took the old woman's hand and held it, and for a moment they were not American and Afghan, not Marine and civilian, not strangers separated by culture and language and war. They were just 2 human beings who understood that some things mattered more than borders. Outside the courtroom, the sun was shining. Yemisi walked down the steps and found a familiar figure waiting at the bottom. Declan Vance. Dressed in a suit she had never seen him wear, his posture straighter than she remembered, something different in his eyes. "You came," she said. "I told you I would." She studied him. The wounds had healed. The gray at his temples seemed lighter somehow, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself, like a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying for far too long. "How did it go?" she asked. "The hearing." Vance smiled, and the expression transformed his face. Honorable discharge. Full restoration of benefits. Formal apology from the Secretary of the Navy. Ashworth is facing his own court-martial now. Turns out those 4 Afghan farmers he wanted me to kill kept very detailed records of who saved their lives. Yemisi felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back, but not before Vance saw. "None of this happens without you," he said. "You know that, right? Polk never would have dug into my case if you had not told her about me. If you had not fought for me the way I fought for you." Yemisi shook her head. "You fought for yourself, Declan. You just needed someone to remind you that you were worth fighting for." They stood there in the sunlight, 2 people who had found each other in the worst place imaginable and emerged stronger for it. Behind them, the courtroom was emptying, the machinery of justice grinding forward to its next case. But for this moment, the world was quiet. "What now?" Vance asked. Yemisi thought about the question. She had been offered a promotion, a transfer to a training command where she could teach the next generation of combat medics. A chance to turn everything she had learned, everything she had survived, into something that could save lives for years to come. "I'm going to keep serving," she said. "Keep saving lives. Keeping the person my brother believed I could be." "And, Chitty, do you still write to him?" Yemisi smiled. "Every week. But I do not burn the letters anymore. I keep them. Someday, when I have children of my own, I want them to know who he was. Who we both were." Vance nodded slowly. He understood. He had his own ghosts to honor, his own letters to write to men who had never read them. "If you ever need someone to fight beside you again," he said, "you know where to find me." She reached out and pulled him into an embrace. He stiffened for just a moment, surprised, and then his arms came around her and held on tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming down that mountain, for being the person who showed up when no one else would." "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me who I was supposed to be." They separated, and Yemisi turned to walk toward the parking lot where her mother was waiting. She had flown in from Oakland for the verdict, had sat in the gallery and watched her daughter face down the man who tried to kill her. Now they would drive home together, and Yemisi would begin the next chapter of her life. She looked back once and saw Van still standing there, watching her go. She raised her hand in a wave, and he returned it. If you connected with this story, drop a comment about what resonated most with you. Maybe you know someone who showed up when no one else would, or someone who found their way back to honor when it mattered most. 2 warriors, 2 survivors, 2 people who had learned the hardest lesson war could teach. That sometimes the greatest battle is not against the enemy in front of you. It is against the darkness inside, the people who are supposed to stand beside you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone willing to walk through that darkness with you. Someone who refuses to leave you behind.